We are doing a study on the book of Ruth, okay? First of all, as a teacher in a classroom, I want to ask you students, how many of you have been doing your homework, reading the devotional? Oh, Pastor Tommy, look at our students. Huh? Very naughty students, yeah? Nggak mau bikin PR, ini bandel-bandel nih anaknya. All right, so I hope you will read the devotional, the link that Pastor Tommy is sending. If you're not part of the broadcast, you can kindly give your number to him, and he will make sure that you receive the broadcast. Rajiv, have you been reading Ruth? No? Naughty, yeah? With your Bible study, okay. All right, so Ruth, introduction and chapter 1. Actually, I won't be touching on chapter 1 today. Pastor Tommy will be doing that. I'll just do the introduction of the book. So the verse here that I found very fascinating in the book of Ruth is, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you will go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Amazing. That's a proclamation of faith from Ruth. Now let's look at the book of Ruth. Who actually wrote the book of Ruth? Many scholars believe it was Samuel who wrote the book of Ruth. And many scholars believe that the book of Ruth and the book of Judges were actually one book. All right, originally it was one book. It was later separated for some reason. And we see from chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Ruth, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." So we can see there was mention of the judges, so it is an indication that it was actually one book. And when were the book of Judges and Ruth written? The book of Judges, it is believed that it was written during the time when Saul had become king. Now, how do we know this? And this is how you can actually, how people actually study the Bible and how we find clues from the verses within the book itself. So if you can see here, it says, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." This kind of verse is scattered throughout Judges. So this is a clue that we can get that the writer was writing to the people in his time, and at that time there was already a king. That's why he had to mention during that time there was no king. You get what I mean, right? So he was writing at the time there was already a king, and he was referring to the time of Judges when there was no king. So it is believed it was during the time of Saul. Now, why do I say that? Let's look at another clue. Here, we at the end of the book of Ruth, the name of David is mentioned. I mean, why would the writer mention David? It's about Ruth, right? But then suddenly there's David. So we can see here it's an indicator that this book was written when David was already a prominent figure, but because his name was not mentioned King David, you see here it was just mentioned David, not King David. So it could mean that this book was written at a time when David was already anointed to be king, but had not ascended to the throne. You know what I mean, right? So these are clues that we can get, all right, from the book. And scholars look at this when they determine the time when this book was written. Now, just want to mention that the events of Ruth, okay, it happened during 1160 BC and 1100. And this was written, the book of Ruth was written between 1011 to 931 BC, probably during the time of King Saul. This is the outline of the book of Ruth. I really hope you will read it. I really encourage you to read it. So Elimelech brought his family, Naomi and the two kids, to go to Moab because there was famine in the land of Israel. So they went there, but then Elimelech dies, the two sons dies, and then Naomi is confronted with the fact that she has to make a choice whether to stay in Moab or go back to Israel, and the famine had ended, so she decided to go back to Israel, and she was, the two daughter-in-laws, who were now widows, all three of them were widows, they decided to go, and Naomi said, "Don't come with me, go back home." Oprah, the older daughter-in-law, decided to go back, but then Ruth decided to go with her, and then Ruth decided to find an income for the family by gleaning the fields. At that time, God had made a provision for the Israelites, the poor Israelites, that if you were poor, you can go through the farm, you can go through the vineyards, and whatever the harvesters pick, and it actually drops on the ground. The harvesters were not allowed to pick them up again, but it was left for the poor to pick up, and they could bring it home. Okay, so that's what Ruth did, and then later on, Ruth indicated her desire to Boaz, the boss who owned the field, that she wanted him to be the kinsman redeemer. What is the kinsman redeemer? Is somebody from the relative of the husband who was still alive and who would actually marry the widow who was left. And when he marries her, when they have children, the child would actually be the descendant of the dead husband, okay, and would carry on the name. And the property of that family would be transferred to this kinsman redeemer. And so the property will not be lost, okay. You have to understand, Israel at that time was divided into tribes, and they wanted the land to remain within the tribe. And they didn't want anybody outside of the tribe to take the land away. So they wanted to preserve that. And so the first best choice was the kinsman redeemer. The nearest kinsman redeemer of Naomi and Ruth allows Boaz to take responsibility for caring for them. Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son, Obed, okay? And then it's a happy ending. So read it. Ruth was a Moabite. Now, this was a problem. Ruth was a Moabite. David was a descendant of a Moabite. So many were questioning his right to be king. And we'll find out why being a Moabite was actually a problem later on. So Ruth's faith, dedication, kindness, love, faithfulness, humility had to be emphasized to show that she was a believer of God. Now, who are the Moabites? Let's look at this. The Moabites are actually descendants from Lot. Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham. Remember Lot and his family, they were in Sodom and Gomorrah. And when God wanted to bring judgment to Sodom and Gomorrah, God had actually spoken to Abraham and said that I'm going to bring this calamity on them. And Abraham bargained with him, and Lot and the family were rescued. But then unfortunately, the wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. But then Lot and the two daughters, they went into the mountain, and they couldn't be in any town because it was dangerous at the time. So they were left on their own, and the two daughters were very naughty. They said, hey, let's make a descendant with a father. So they slept with the father. Yes, it's actually in the Bible. Amazing, right? Crazy story. But it's actually in the Bible. And then they had children, and the youngest daughter had a child called Moab. So this is the descendant of Lot, and this was out of incest. So amazing. Now, when the Israelites were traveling in the wilderness, and they were going to the promised land, the king of Moab, called Balak, he actually hired a prophet called Balaam and said, you pronounce curse on the Israelites. But then God turned the curses into blessing, and God did not allow Balaam to actually curse them. And you know about the talking donkey story? That happened with Balaam, all right? Now, when the Israelites, but what happened was, Balaam, the prophet, he was pretty greedy because he was not allowed by God to pronounce curse. He still wanted the money. So he said, I've got a strategy. He told the women of the Moabite, he said, why don't you entice the man and bring them into a relationship and bring them into sexual immorality. And once you catch them into sexual immorality, it's easier to take them into idolatry. And that's what they did. They actually, the women followed the strategy of Balaam, and they enticed the man. They had sexual immorality, and then it was much easier to bring them into idolatry. And as a result of this, 24,000 people in Israel actually died because of that. So Balaam was pretty wicked. And we can see here that Balaam was killed later on by the Israelites. Even though some people wonder, why was he killed? He did not pronounce the curse. No, because he told the women to entice the Israelites. That's what happened. So we can see here that God actually did not want Israel to have any connection with the Moabites, and he wanted them to eradicate the Moabites. But God, because of his promise to Abraham, and because he loved Abraham, and he honored Abraham, and he honored the promise he made with Abraham, he said, I will give Lot and the descendants this land. And he told the Israelites, don't touch them, don't touch their land, because I've given it to them. However, there's this verse which is a problem, And this is why the book of Ruth was written, all right? This is the key thing. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. All right? Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. 4 generations. So it says, 10th generation, they should not enter the assembly. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way, even though they were cousins, when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram, Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. So this was the reason why God did not want them to let them into the assembly. But the problem was David was the 4th descendant of a Moabite woman. So how do we reconcile this? Why was David allowed to be king? Not just enter the assembly, but allowed to be king. So David was a descendant of a Moabite. So was he prohibited from entering the assembly of the Lord? That is, prohibited from being part of the general Israelite community and the religious community? That was the big question. Now, here's the response, okay? The Jews dealt with this at that time. So the Orthodox Jewish reconciliation of this matter is that the restriction on Moabites becoming Israelites did not apply to female Moabites. It only applied to the men, because they were the ones who refused to actually give food when the Israelites were passing through the land. And so Ruth was a female descendant of the Moabites, so it did not apply to her. And when Moses gave the Moabite restriction of Deuteronomy, he was referring to the non-converted, uncircumcised alien or foreigners who were not allowed to be part of the general assembly. Ruth may have been a Moabite ethnically, but she was a dedicated follower of the Lord. She had adopted the faith of the Israelites. So she was allowed. This was an exception here, okay? And she participated and abided by Mosaic law. Therefore, she was accepted, and her descendants. Another reason, and this is a good thing for us to know, knowledge, biblical knowledge, Deuteronomy 23 would not have applied to Ruth and her offspring, because a non-Israelite mother in Israel, especially a proselyte, those who had come to faith into the Judaism, did not determine the nationality of the offspring. It was the father who determined the nationality of the offspring. You look at Joseph, who married an Egyptian, okay, but when the children were born, they were considered Israelites. You look at Moses, he was married to Zipporah, a Midianite, but when the children were born, they were considered Israelites. Not a Midianite, not an Egyptian for Joseph, all right? So it did not make David a Moabite. It made him an Israelite. So the purpose of not mixing with the Moabites was to prevent paganism from infiltrating the holiness of God's people, and Ruth was an exception. She did not bring her pagan religion into Israel. She actually adopted the faith. Now, so we can see here that this was very clear, that Ruth was different, was an exception, and so David was allowed to enter into the assembly. Now, what are the lessons we can learn here? First, the devil knows the plans of God, and he will try to hinder the plans of God. If we look at how God works with his people, okay, we look at the Israelites, how God had been planning to form a nation. It did not just come suddenly. He had been planning long before. He planned it with Abraham. He worked with Abraham. He worked with Isaac. He worked with Jacob. It was a long-term planning. And so it was the same when he wanted to raise David to be a king. It was a long-term planning. It wasn't just suddenly. So you can see God had already planned even 4 generations before to bring up a king, and he was working through the life of Ruth. And so God had planned everything. God was not going to allow his plans to be foiled by the devil. And so he inspired Samuel and said, you have to write this book and reveal the truth so that we can foil, we can destroy what the devil is trying to do. So, there's a lot of rumors that will go around that will spread lies. Usually rumors include lies and half-truths, right? And so at that time, there was a lot of rumors about this Ruth was a Moabite. How can David become king? Especially those from the Benjamites who was pro-Saul. They were probably against David becoming king. So Samuel had to reveal the truth. In order to defeat the lies, you have to reveal the truth. So the facts and the truth were revealed by Samuel. And he says, Ruth was different. Ruth was a kind woman. She had faith in God. She obeyed God. And she also sacrificed her life. She could have stayed in Moab. She could have gotten married to somebody and she could have had a good life. But she went into the unknown. She went into a different nation. She didn't know this nation and she didn't know this culture. She adopted and she was willing to make herself poor and take care of her aged mother-in-law, which is not easy. Those of you who take care of parents, you know. So she was willing to do all that, and she was willing to glean through all the fields. Why? Because she had faith in God, and she knew that when she put her faith in this God, no matter what unknown thing she went into, she knew God was going to take care of her. And so Samuel wanted to reveal this truth and tell her, look at what Ruth did, and look at her life, and look at how God worked through her faith and through her obedience to the law. So don't underestimate this Ruth, and don't question why she was a Moabite, and don't question David's kingship. That was the key, the point, what Samuel was trying to reveal to the people. And Samuel knew that he was aged. He was going to come to the point where he would die before he would see David ascend to the throne. And he knew before David would ascend to the throne, there would be people that would make an issue of this. So he had to put it in writing to make sure that when he died, this book would reveal the truth about David's great-grandmother. So this was an amazing thing. You see how God worked in this. When you understand the whole background about Ruth and how God allowed Samuel to write, you're amazed. And that's why I'm like, when people criticize the Bible without understanding what the Bible is and how God works, I'm like, you're so foolish. You don't understand. You're just making comments about the Bible, about Christianity, that you don't understand how God works and the background and all those things. When you learn the background, it's amazing. You learn more about God and you learn how He works. And the kindness that Ruth showed to the mother-in-law was amazing, was splendid, was extraordinary. I mean, she was in her age where she was coming to that point where she may not be able to have kids anymore. And she was willing to risk it all and not have any descendant, possible of not having descendant, going into the unknown to take care of her mother-in-law so that the mother-in-law won't be alone. That was amazing. Now, another thing, the last point I want to mention was her faith. Her faith was deep. How do I know her faith was deep? See, you may be sacrificing things, but you may not be obeying God. You understand what I mean? Saul made sacrifices, but he didn't do it in obedience to God. And God says, I prefer obedience rather than sacrifice. But you have to understand, when we obey God, there will be sacrifices you and I have to make. And the more we obey God, the deeper when we obey God in a more radical way, that means there would be greater sacrifices that we would make in our lives. And the greater the sacrifices that we make, it indicates the deeper our faith is in God. The reason why we're willing to obey God in a radical way and make all those sacrifices is because we really, really, really trust God. And Ruth showed that. She had that deep faith. Can I have my bow and arrow? I want to give you an illustration. It's not complete without an illustration. Bow and arrow. But see, when we have deep faith, okay, God actually can move further with our faith. And He can make a greater impact. Not just in your lives and your family lives, but it could go even further than that. Amen? So we can see here, because of our deep faith, you can see the impact that it made reach up to the fourth generation. Not just the fourth generation, it reached up to the Messiah. The Messiah came through a lineage. This indicates your faith. The deeper that your faith is, the further this bow will go, right? So this shows that when you have deeper faith in God and you make deeper sacrifices for God, God is not going to turn a blind eye to that, but He's going to see that and honor that. And the impact of your deep faith could reach far and beyond, more than you can ever imagine. It could reach different nations. It could reach different generations. It could reach down to your descendants up to the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th generations. So I want to encourage you, have faith in the Lord. It's not going to go waste. Amen. God bless you.